I've always been a cautious man, maybe even a little paranoid, but in today's world, I'd argue that's just common sense, especially after what happened. My name is Ryan, and I used to live in a small, quiet town where everyone knew each other by name. It was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened, where the biggest news was if someone's dog went missing. But that all changed a few months ago. I remember the first time I heard about him, this guy who was pretending to be a cop. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a rumor, something the old-timers would gossip about at the diner. "Did you hear about the fake cop pulling people over?" they'd whisper, shaking their heads. The story was always vague, second-hand at best, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt in everyone's mind. At first, I dismissed it. I'm not one to buy into rumors. But then one night, I saw him for myself. It was late, probably around 11 p.m., and I was driving home from a late shift at the factory. The roads were empty, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, making you hyper-aware of every little sound. The only thing breaking the silence was the steady hum of my engine. Then, out of nowhere, I saw the flashing lights in my rear-view mirror. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't been speeding, and there was no reason for a cop to be pulling me over. But those lights, red and blue, pulsating like some kind of warning, they were unmistakable. I pulled over, rolling down my window as I watched the patrol car come to a stop behind me. The man who got out looked the part, uniform, badge, even the walk. But something was off. It wasn't just his appearance. It was the way he moved, too smooth, almost rehearsed, and his eyes. God, those eyes were cold. They didn't have the look of someone just doing their job. No, they were scanning me, studying me like I was some kind of prey. "License and registration," he barked, his voice low and gravelly. It was the tone that did it, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He wasn't asking, he was demanding. And there was something else, a hint of something I couldn't quite place at first. As I fumbled with my wallet, I caught a whiff of something. Alcohol. Not a lot, but enough that it hit me like a slap to the face. My heart started pounding, my brain screaming at me that something wasn't right. I handed over my license, trying to keep my hands from shaking. He snatched it from me, holding it up to the light from his flashlight, but he wasn't really looking at it. No, his eyes kept flicking back to me, like he was waiting for something. "What's your name?" he asked, though he was holding my ID. "Ryan," I replied, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. He nodded, but his eyes never left mine. "Where you headed, Ryan?" "Home," I said. "Just finished my shift at the factory." He nodded again, but there was something in his expression that sent a chill down my spine. His eyes narrowed, and I could see the gears turning in his head, like he was trying to decide something. Then out of nowhere, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, though. It was the kind of smile a predator gives just before it strikes. "Stay safe out there," he said, handing back my license. I nodded, too rattled to do anything else. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. But as I drove off, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just dodged a bullet. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. Something was off about that guy, and the more I replayed it in my head, the more certain I became. I decided to ask around, see if anyone else had a run-in with this so-called cop. It didn't take long before I found others who had similar stories. Late-night stops, strange questions, that same unsettling feeling. But no one had done anything about it. No one had reported it. That's when I knew I had to do something. I went to the real police, told them everything. They listened, took notes. but I could tell they didn't really believe me. They probably thought I was just another paranoid guy seeing things that weren't there. But I knew what I'd seen, and I wasn't about to let it slide. Days turned into weeks, and the reports kept coming in. The fake cop was getting bolder, stopping more people, staying out later. The whole town was on edge. People were afraid to drive at night, and the trust that had once held our community together was slowly unraveling. Then one night, it happened again. I was driving home, same route as always, when I saw the lights. This time, though, I was ready. I pulled over, but instead of rolling down my window, I grabbed my phone. I dialed 911, keeping my eyes on the rearview mirror as the man got out of his car. He looked the same as before, same uniform, same cold eyes. But this time, there was something different in his expression. He was tense, almost like he knew the game was up. He walked up to my window, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "License and registration," he said, his voice a little less steady than before. I didn't move. "I'm calling 911 to verify your identity," I said, my voice firm. His eyes widened, and for a split second, I saw something flash across his face. Fear, maybe, or desperation. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He turned and bolted back to his car, speeding off into the night. I sat there, heart pounding, as the real police arrived minutes later. I told them what had happened, gave them a description of the man, his car, everything. They promised to investigate, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Weeks passed and the stops stopped. The fake cop vanished as quickly as he'd appeared, leaving nothing but fear and unanswered questions in his wake. The police never caught him, never even got close. To this day, no one knows who he was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget those eyes, that cold, calculating gaze. I still live in that town, but it's not the same. The sense of safety we once had is gone, replaced by a lingering unease that never quite goes away. And every time I see flashing lights in my rearview mirror, I can't help but wonder if it's him, waiting, watching, ready to strike again. I never imagined the city I called home could turn into a hunting ground. The bustling streets, once filled with the comforting chaos of everyday life, now felt like a maze where danger lurked around every corner. But it wasn't until that night, the night that everything changed, that I realized just how close the danger really was. It was late, past midnight. I had stayed late at work, trying to finish up a project that seemed never-ending. By the time I stepped out of the office, the usual clamor of the city had dulled to a low hum. The streets were nearly deserted, save for the occasional car that zipped by, headlights cutting through the darkness. I pulled my coat tighter around me, the chill in the air biting through the fabric. My apartment was only a few blocks away, a short walk I had made countless times before without a second thought. But tonight felt different. There was an uneasy stillness in the air, a sense that something wasn't quite right. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to exhaustion, and began my walk home. I was halfway there when I heard the faint sound of a car engine behind me. It wasn't unusual for a car to pass by at this hour, but this one slowed down as it approached. My heart began to race as I turned my head slightly to catch a glimpse. It was a dark sedan, and as it drew closer, I could see the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights on the dashboard. "Police," I muttered to myself, trying to calm the growing unease in my gut. Maybe they were just on patrol, or responding to a call. But as the car pulled up beside me, my instincts screamed that something was off. The window rolled down, revealing a man in a police uniform. He was clean-cut, with a square jaw and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. His badge glinted under the streetlights, and he gave me a curt nod. "Evening," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "There's been reports of some suspicious activity in the area. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" I hesitated, glancing around. The street was empty, just me and him. I'd always been taught to respect the law, to cooperate with the police. But there was something in his eyes, something cold and calculating, that set off alarm bells in my head. "What kind of suspicious activity?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just some break-ins," he replied smoothly. "We're doing routine checks in the area. Do you live around here?" "Yeah, just a few blocks away." "Mind showing me your ID?" I fumbled with my wallet, my fingers trembling slightly as I handed him my driver's license. He studied it for a moment, then looked back at me, his gaze lingering a little too long. I shifted uncomfortably, a sense of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. "Why don't you step over here?" he said, nodding toward the sidewalk. "I just need to verify a few things." Every fiber of my being told me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. I forced myself to move, stepping closer to the car. The street was eerily quiet, the only sound the low rumble of the engine. He asked me a few more questions, all routine, but his tone grew darker with each one. I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. My pulse quickened, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. "You've got nothing to worry about," he said, a hint of a smile curling at the corners of his mouth. "Just doing my job." But the smile didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes, dark, predatory, were locked on mine, and I knew in that moment that I was in serious trouble. Suddenly, he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Get in the car." Panic surged through me. "What? Why?" "Just get in," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I won't ask again." I took a step back, my mind racing. This wasn't right. No cop would behave like this. But before I could react, he grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. Instinct kicked in. I wrenched my arm free and bolted, my heart pounding in my ears. I heard him curse behind me, the sound of the car door slamming open. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My only thought was to run, to get away from him. The street blurred around me as I sprinted toward the nearest light, a gas station at the corner. My lungs burned, my legs aching with every step. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I burst through the doors of the gas station, startling the cashier behind the counter. I gasped out a plea for help, my voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. The cashier's eyes widened as he saw the terror in mine. He quickly moved to the phone, dialing 911 while I collapsed against the counter, trying to catch my breath. Minutes later, real police officers arrived. I recounted what had happened, my voice shaking as I described the man who had posed as one of them. The officers exchanged grim looks, confirming my worst fears. "He's been at this for weeks," one of them said, his expression dark. "We've been getting reports, but he always slips away before we can catch him." The city I thought I knew had become a hunting ground, and I had just narrowly escaped being the Night Stalker's latest prey. As I sat there, surrounded by the flashing lights of real police cars, I couldn't shake the image of his cold, predatory eyes and the knowledge that he was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting to strike again. I had always found solace in the open road. The long, winding stretches of highway offered a sense of freedom that I couldn't find anywhere else. So when I set out on a solo road trip to clear my mind after a rough few weeks, I expected nothing more than a peaceful drive through the desolate back roads of the Midwest. Little did I know, this trip would soon become a waking nightmare that I would never forget. It was a scorching summer afternoon, the kind where the heat waves dance on the asphalt and the sky stretches endlessly above, without a single cloud in sight. I'd been driving for hours, the miles blending into a monotonous blur as the sun beat down relentlessly. The landscape around me was barren, just flat plains as far as the eye could see. It was one of those highways where you could go for miles without seeing another car, let alone a town, the kind of place where loneliness clings to you like a second skin. I was lost in my thoughts, my mind drifting with the rhythm of the road, when I noticed the flashing lights in my rearview mirror. A sudden jolt of anxiety shot through me. I wasn't speeding, and I knew I hadn't run any stop signs. What could it be? A random check, maybe. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as I eased off the gas and pulled over to the side of the road. The car that pulled up behind me wasn't a typical police cruiser. It was an unmarked sedan, black and nondescript, the kind that could easily blend into any parking lot. As I watched, a man got out and started walking towards me. He was dressed in a police uniform, or at least it looked like one. But there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. His uniform seemed slightly wrinkled, his badge a little too dull, like it was made of cheap plastic. He had a stern expression on his face, but his eyes were what set off alarm bells in my mind. They were shifty, darting around like he was afraid someone might be watching. My stomach tightened with unease as he approached my window. "Afternoon, sir. You were going a bit fast back there," he said, his voice gruff and authoritative. But there was a tremor in his tone, a subtle hint of something that made my skin crawl. I hadn't been speeding, I was sure of it. But I kept my mouth shut and nodded, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that was gnawing at my insides. "Can I see your license and registration?" he asked, holding out his hand. I hesitated for a split second, my mind racing. Something was very wrong here. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from this man as possible. But what could I do? He was wearing a uniform, had a badge. He had to be a cop, right? Reluctantly, I handed over my documents, watching as he took them back to his car. He didn't go far, just a few steps away, still within my line of sight. He pulled out a radio, speaking into it, but the way he held it seemed off, like he wasn't used to the weight of it. His words were muffled, but I could hear the forced calmness in his voice, like he was putting on a performance. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. This wasn't right. This man wasn't a real cop. I was sure of it now. Panic began to set in, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced around, looking for any sign of help, but there was nothing, just miles of empty road stretching out in both directions. I was completely alone with this man, and I had no idea what he intended to do. He turned back towards me, his face twisted in a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. My heart skipped a beat, and in that instant, I knew I had to act. Before he could reach my window, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, my car lurching forward with a screech of tires. I could hear him shout something, but I didn't look back. The only thing that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between me and him. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I sped down the highway, my mind racing with fear and adrenaline. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my voice shaking as I told the dispatcher what had just happened. They kept me on the line, their calm voice a stark contrast to the chaos inside my head. They told me to keep driving, to get to the nearest town, where real police officers would be waiting for me. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still following me. Every car I passed, every shadow that flickered in my peripheral vision, felt like it could be him. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that black sedan creeping up behind me. The tension was unbearable, the fear gnawing at me like a rabid animal. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the lights of a small town in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with paranoia. What if he was still out there, waiting? The dispatcher guided me to a gas station just off the main road, where 2 patrol cars were parked, their lights flashing. I pulled in, my entire body shaking as I got out of the car. The real officers took my statement, their faces serious as they listened to my account. They confirmed my worst fear. There had been reports of someone impersonating a police officer in the area, pulling over unsuspecting drivers on lonely stretches of highway. They promised to find him, to bring him to justice, but their reassurances did little to calm the storm inside me. Even now, weeks later, I can still see his face in my nightmares, those shifty eyes, that twisted smile. The open road, once my sanctuary, now feels tainted, haunted by the memory of that day. Every time I see flashing lights in my rearview mirror, my heart skips a beat, and the fear comes rushing back. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe on the highway again. All I know is that I came face to face with something evil that day, and it nearly took everything from me.